The dollar was already warm in Kate Wells's palm when the auctioneer pointed at her and laughed. Not a gentle laugh, not a polite chuckle born of surprise. It was the kind of laugh that rolled out of a man's belly and spread through a crowd like fever, catching in throats, lighting up eyes, turning 30 sun-hardened faces toward the woman standing at the back of the packed auction yard in Caldwell, Kansas, in the dry and merciless summer of 1879. The kind of laugh that was meant to diminish, to reduce, to remind a woman exactly where she stood in the accounting of the world. Kate did not flinch. She had used up all her flinching in the 2 years since Thomas Wells had died of a rattlesnake bite 3 miles out on the open plain, leaving her with a half-broken homestead, a mule named Patience, $63 in hidden savings that the bank somehow already knew about, and a debt that had been growing like a tumor ever since. The auctioneer, a greasy-collared man named Harlan Dodd who smelled of bay rum and bad intentions, held up one fat hand to quiet the crowd. He was standing on the raised platform beside the table where the ledgers lay open, and beside those ledgers stood the object of today's particular cruelty, the Wells property deed. 160 acres of Kansas grassland, a farmhouse Kate had rebuilt with her own 2 hands, a well she had dug herself in the 2nd year of drought, and a barn that still smelled faintly of the lavender she had planted along its south wall to keep the flies off the horses. $1, Harlan Dodd repeated, tilting his enormous hat back and grinning with yellow teeth. Lady says $1 for the Wells homestead. Anybody want to add to that bid before I commence to crying? More laughter. Delbert Crane, who sat in the front row with his thumbs in his suspenders and his 2 sons flanking him like hired muscle, did not laugh. He watched Kate with pale, calculating eyes. Delbert Crane had wanted the Wells land for 3 years. He had wanted it when Thomas was alive and had made one quiet, low offer that Thomas had refused. He had wanted it in the year after Thomas died, when he had sent one of his sons around to make the same offer with a harder face. And he had maneuvered his way into owning Kate's bank debt 6 months ago, which was exactly why the Wells homestead was on the auction block today, in the dirt yard behind the Caldwell Commerce and Land Exchange, on a Tuesday morning in July that was already hot enough to make the horizon shimmer. Kate's hand tightened around the dollar. She had not come here to win the auction. She had understood that before she laced her boots that morning, before she braided her dark hair and pinned it, before she fed Patience and walked the 4 miles into town because she had sold the wagon 2 months back. She had come because not coming felt like dying, and she had decided somewhere in the cold of last winter that she was finished with dying things. She had come because there was always a chance. Because the world had surprised her before, both for worse and for better, and because standing in the back of a crowd with $1 and the deed to her life felt more honest than hiding at home, while strangers divided up everything she had built. What she had not expected in all her careful and sleepless preparation was Noah Yates. She had not expected him at all. He was standing on the far side of the auction yard, leaning against the post of the split-rail fence with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, and she did not notice him until the moment Harlan Dodd laughed. Because when the laughter broke across the yard, Noah Yates did not join it. He went very still. And stillness, in a crowd of moving, laughing people, is the thing that catches a careful woman's eye. Kate did not know his name yet. She did not know that he had ridden 4 days south from Abilene, with a letter folded in his coat pocket, and a dark past that followed him like his own shadow. She did not know what he had lost, or what had been taken from him, or why a man who clearly had no stake in the proceedings of this particular Tuesday morning was standing in the auction yard of Caldwell, Kansas, with his jaw set like iron and his eyes fixed on Harlan Dodd with an expression that was 3 parts fury and 1 part something older and quieter that Kate could not yet name. She would learn all of it. Every last secret, every buried grief, every hidden motive and forbidden truth. She would learn it the hard way, which is the only way the frontier ever taught anything. But that was later. That was after. For now, there was only the dollar in her hand and the laughter in the air and the pale, watching eyes of Delbert Crane, and somewhere across the yard, the stillness of a stranger who had not yet decided what he was going to do next. The story, as it so often does, had begun much earlier. Kate Emmeline Wells had come to Kansas from Ohio in 1871, when she was 22 years old and freshly married to Thomas Wells, who had charm enough for 3 men and the practical skills of half a one. She had loved Thomas. That was important to say clearly and without apology. She had loved him in the particular way that young women love men who make the world feel larger and more possible, who talk about the horizon like it is a promise rather than a threat. Thomas had been alive in a way that most people were not. He had laughed easily and dreamed extravagantly, and he had looked at the Kansas grassland like it was a kingdom waiting for a king. The trouble was that kingdoms required building, and building required the patient, grinding, blistered work of actual hands on actual ground, and Thomas had been better at the dreaming part than the building part. Kate had understood this about 2 years into the marriage, somewhere around the time she had finished rechinking the farmhouse walls herself, because Thomas had started 3 other projects and abandoned all of them. She had not loved him less for it. She had simply adjusted her understanding of who did what, and she had done what needed doing, and in the years that followed she had found that she was, in some ways she had not expected, a genuinely capable woman. She could read a weather sky. She could negotiate with a seed merchant. She could fix a pump and treat a sick animal and calculate exactly how many bushels of winter wheat they needed to clear their debt for the year. She had discovered these things about herself in the wide, difficult classroom of the Kansas plain, and the discovering had given her a kind of quiet satisfaction that she carried like ballast. Thomas had died in May of 1877. He had ridden out early on a clear morning to check the fence line on the eastern edge of their property, and the rattlesnake had been in the tall grass near the second post, and he had not made it back. A neighboring farmer named Abe Prout had found the horse standing alone near the road and followed the tracks. Thomas had been gone for 6 hours by then. Kate had handled his death the way she handled everything, with the particular combination of grief and practicality that the frontier demanded. She had buried him on the low hill south of the house, where the wild grass grew tallest. She had wept properly and alone in the farmhouse for 3 consecutive nights, and then she had gotten up on the 4th day and made a list of everything that needed doing. The debt had been the first and most persistent problem. Thomas had borrowed against the land twice, once to build the barn, and once in a bad drought year to buy enough seed to get through the planting season. The loans had been held by the First Commerce Bank of Caldwell, which was a respectable enough institution run by a decent enough manager named Harold Finch, and Kate had made her payments without fail for the first year of her widowhood. The second year had brought a crop failure, and then a second. 2 seasons of insufficient rain, of scorched wheat, of a Kansas summer that seemed to be operating under a personal vendetta. Kate had sold the wagon and the second horse and the spare tools, and 3 of the 6 pieces of furniture Thomas's mother had sent from Ohio. She had eaten less than she should have and worked more than was wise, and she had still, by December of 1878, fallen behind on the bank payment. That was when she had learned about Delbert Crane. Harold Finch had told her himself, which she supposed was the only decent thing about the situation. He had come to the farmhouse on a cold Thursday, hat in hand, looking genuinely miserable, and explained that the bank had sold her debt to a private party, as was their legal right under the terms of the original loan, and that the private party was Delbert Crane of Crane's Creek Ranch, which was the largest cattle operation in the county, and that Mr. Crane had exercised his right under the terms to call the full balance of the debt immediately due. The full balance was $412. Kate had $4.60 in the coffee tin above the stove. She had looked at Harold Finch for a long moment, and Harold Finch had looked at the floor, and the wind had come off the plain and rattled the farmhouse windows, and the whole terrible shape of it had become clear. Delbert Crane was going to take her land. She had spent the months between that Thursday and the auction trying every avenue she could think of. She had written letters to the land office in Topeka. She had spoken to the only lawyer in Caldwell, a thin young man named Fletcher Price who had been sympathetic and ultimately helpless. She had appealed personally to Harold Finch, who had looked genuinely sorry but explained that the sale of the debt had been perfectly legal, and his hands were tied. She had even considered writing to her sister in Ohio, but her sister had 4 children and a struggling husband, and Kate had too much pride to ask for money she knew could not be given. She had found exactly $1 that she could spare, and she had walked the 4 miles to the Caldwell Commerce and Land Exchange on a Tuesday morning in July with that dollar in her hand, not because she thought it would save her, but because she refused to let Delbert Crane have her land without at least bearing witness to the taking of it. Which brought her back to the auction yard, and Harlan Dodd's laughter, and the stillness of the stranger against the fence. Harlan Dodd had stopped laughing and was working himself up to accepting Delbert Crane's sealed bid, which everyone in the yard understood was the only real bid, and had probably been arranged before the auction was even formally announced. That was how Delbert Crane operated. Quietly through legitimate-looking mechanisms with just enough of the law on his side to be untouchable. He did not steal, he purchased, he arranged, he positioned. It was the most infuriating kind of wrong because it left you with nothing to point at and no one to accuse. Going once at $1, Harlan Dodd said, and his eyes were already drifting toward Crane with a question. Crane gave the smallest nod. Going twice at $412. The voice came from across the yard. Low, even, carrying without strain, the voice of a man accustomed to speaking in open spaces where the wind competed. Every head in the yard turned. Noah Yates had pushed off the fence post. He was standing upright now, and Kate could see him properly for the first time. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor living into something angular and difficult to read. He was wearing a dark coat that had seen considerable use and boots that had seen more. He was not wearing his hat anymore. He was holding it in one hand, and his dark hair, slightly too long and touched at the temples with the first suggestion of gray, was catching the July sun. He looked, Kate thought, like a man who had made a very large and possibly foolish decision in the last 30 seconds and was not going to back away from it. He looked, in other words, very much like the kind of trouble she could not afford. The yard had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to have paused to listen. Harlan Dodd blinked. "I beg your pardon. $412, Noah Yates said again, walking forward through the crowd, which parted for him with the instinctive courtesy given to men who take up space with conviction. He reached the base of the auction platform, reached into his coat, and produced a folded piece of paper that he held up without unfolding. Bank draft from the First National of Abilene, dated this week, good as gold. Harlan Dodd stared at the bank draft with the expression of a man whose well-ordered morning had just been disrupted by something he had not been paid to account for. He looked at Delbert Crane. Delbert Crane's pale eyes had gone flat and very cold. He was looking at Noah Yates with the careful attention of a man cataloging a threat. "That's the precise amount of the outstanding debt on the Wells homestead," Noah Yates said, addressing the yard now rather than just the auctioneer. "Public record. I checked at the land office before I came." He finally looked at Harlan Dodd again. "The law says the auction minimum must accommodate the debt settlement. $1 doesn't do it. $412 does." Fletcher Price, the thin young lawyer, was standing near the side of the crowd, and Kate saw his mouth open slightly as he worked through the legal logic. Then he closed his mouth and gave a single, nearly imperceptible nod. It was legal. Bizarre, unexpected, and apparently legal. Harlan Dodd looked at Crane again. Crane's jaw was tight. He said nothing. There was nothing he could say, not in front of 30 witnesses, not without exposing the arrangement that everyone suspected and no one could prove. $412, Harlan Dodd said, slowly, like a man reading a sentence he did not entirely understand. Going once. Kate Wells had stopped breathing somewhere around the moment the stranger had spoken. She made herself start again. Going twice. She looked at Delbert Crane. He was looking at the stranger. The stranger was looking at the auctioneer. Nobody was looking at Kate. Sold, said Harlan Dodd, to the gentleman in the dark coat. The crowd broke into noise, not applause exactly. The frontier was too practical for applause at an auction. But there was a shift of energy, the kind that happens when something surprising occurs, and people are still deciding whether they are glad or unsettled. Crane stood up and walked out of the yard without speaking to anyone. His sons followed him, and the crowd parted for them the same way it had parted for the stranger, but differently. The way a crowd parts for thunder rather than for surprise. Kate moved before she thought about it. She pushed through the dissolving crowd toward the auction platform, arriving just as Noah Yates was completing his transaction with Harlan Dodd, signing his name on the deed record with a pen that scratched loudly in the now quiet yard. "Excuse me," Kate said. He looked up. She had not been close enough before to see his eyes properly. They were dark brown, nearly black in the shadow of the platform's overhang, and they were looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was not pity. She was grateful for that. She had been on the receiving end of enough pity in the last 2 years to last several lifetimes. It was something more complex, something that had weight to it. "You bought my land," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He stepped down from the platform, and they were standing at roughly the same level, which was something, since she was not a short woman and he was considerably taller. He held out his hand. In it was the deed. "My name is Noah Yates," he said. "And I believe this belongs to you." Kate looked at the deed. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. "I don't understand," she said, and she was angry, she realized, which surprised her. She had expected to feel relieved. She felt angry instead, the way you feel angry when someone does something kind in a situation where you had armored yourself for the worst, because kindness without explanation is its own kind of threat. "You spent $412 on property you're handing directly back to me. That is not a sensible thing to do." Something in his expression shifted, almost, she thought, like the beginning of a smile that thought better of itself. "No," he agreed. "It isn't, so I'll ask again. Why?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the deed still extended between them. "Because someone did it for me once," he said, "and I've been trying to square the debt ever since." It was not a complete answer. She knew it was not a complete answer. There were hidden layers in it, things folded underneath the words that would take time to unfold. But the July sun was pressing down on the back of her neck, and her feet were aching from the 4-mile walk, and she was still holding the $1 she had come with, and the deed was there in his hand. She took the deed. "I cannot pay you back," she said very directly, because she was not a woman who softened truths. "Not now and possibly not ever." "I'm not asking you to," he said. "Then what are you asking?" He looked at her with those dark, complicated eyes, and for just a moment something crossed his face that she would spend weeks trying to identify. It was the expression of a man who had traveled a very long distance and arrived at a destination he was not entirely certain he deserved. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing at all." She did not believe him. She had been on the frontier too long to believe in entirely uncomplicated gestures. But she took the deed and she thanked him, shortly and with the crisp courtesy that was all she had to offer, and she walked back through the thinning crowd toward the road that led home. She was halfway down the main street of Caldwell when she heard his bootsteps behind her, not running, just walking at the same pace as her own. She stopped. He stopped. She turned around. "You're following me," she said. "I'm walking in the same direction," he said. "The livery stable is on this road. Where are you staying?" "I was going to figure that out." She regarded him with the particular evaluating look she gave to weather systems and seed merchants. He held her gaze without flinching, which she noted. A lot of people flinched under that look. "The boarding house is on Merchant Street," she said. "Mrs. Acker runs it. She is clean and fair and will not overcharge you if you don't look like you can afford it." "I can afford it," he said. "Good," said Kate Wells, and she turned and walked home. She thought about him the entire 4 miles. Not in the way she had thought about men in the years before Thomas. The giddy, dizzy thinking of a young woman with an uncomplicated heart. This was the more cautious, analytical thinking of a 30-year-old widow with a saved homestead and a head full of questions about a man she had known for 8 minutes who had spent $412 for no stated reason. Who was Noah Yates? What dark past had sent him 4 days south from Abilene to the specific auction yard of a specific Caldwell, Kansas, land exchange on a specific Tuesday in July? What was in that letter she had seen folded in his coat pocket? What had been done to him that made him, as he had put it, square a debt to a stranger who had never done him anything? The questions bothered her more than she liked. She was not a woman given to extended curiosity about strangers. She had been, once. The frontier had cured her of it. Along with several other romantic inclinations, she had arrived in Kansas carrying like unnecessary luggage. She fed Patience the mule and made herself a supper of cornbread and dried beans and sat on the front step of the farmhouse as the sun went down, watching the grass go gold and then amber and then the deep, dark green of evening, and she held the deed in her hands and looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. Noah Yates. A confident signature. The signature of a man who had signed his name to things that mattered. She put the deed in the coffee tin above the stove, next to the $4.60, and she went to bed. She did not sleep well. He came back the next morning. She heard the horse on the road before she saw him, and she was outside by the time he reached the gate because she was always outside early. He was riding a solid-looking roan horse with the easy seat of a man who had spent a great deal of his life on horseback, and he was carrying his hat again, which she was beginning to think might be a habit. "Mrs. Wells," he said, stopping at the gate. "Mr. Yates," she said. She was holding a bucket. She had been going to the well. "I didn't expect to see you again." "I didn't expect to come," he said, "but I found myself with questions." She set down the bucket. "So did I," she said. "Come inside." It was a practical invitation, made because the sun was already getting strong and because the questions between them needed a table between two people rather than a gate between two strangers. She made coffee on the cast-iron stove, the good coffee she saved for occasions, and she put 2 cups on the table and sat down across from him in the kitchen of the farmhouse she had nearly lost yesterday. "You first," she said. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He had large hands, she noticed. Calloused. Not the hands of a man who had spent his life in offices. "How long have you been out here alone?" he asked. 2 years, she said. "Since Thomas died. Your husband." "Yes," he nodded once as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "The land office had your records," he said. "It's how I knew the exact amount of the debt." He looked up at her. "I was in Caldwell the day before the auction. I saw the notice posted at the land office. I read it. And you decided on the spot to spend $400. $412. $412, she said, on a stranger's land problem. "Yes, that is an extraordinary thing to do," she said. "It is," he agreed, and he did not look embarrassed by it, which she found strange. Most men who did impulsive things were either defensive about them afterward or falsely casual. He was neither. He looked, if anything, like a man who had examined his decision from multiple angles and found it sound. "You said someone did something similar for you," Kate said. "Yes. Tell me that story." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the coffee cup. Outside, a meadowlark was singing on the fence post, the clear, liquid call that Kate had learned to love in her first Kansas spring and had never grown tired of. Finally he said, 10 years ago I was 23. I had a ranch in Texas. Small one. I'd worked for 5 years to buy it. My partner turned out to be a man with a hidden motive. He falsified our shared debts, claimed I owed him money I did not owe, and when I couldn't prove it in time, he moved to have the property sold. Was there an auction? Kate asked. There was, he said. And a man I barely knew, a rancher from 2 counties over who had met me twice, stood up and paid the debt. He said he'd seen enough men of bad faith win enough things that shouldn't have been won, and he was tired of it. What happened to your partner? He was caught doing the same thing to someone else 2 years later. Did a year in a Texas prison. He paused. What happened to his victim was not as fortunate. I was there both times. The difference was that one man stood up. Kate absorbed this. And the man who helped you? Dead, Noah said, and the word was quiet but heavy. 3 years ago, fever. He had a wife and 2 sons. I helped where I could after, but I've been carrying the rest of it ever since, looking for the right place to put it down. She looked at him across the table. The meadowlark had stopped singing. The kitchen was very still, smelling of coffee and the dried herbs she kept hanging near the window. That's a true story, she said, not a question, a statement. Yes, he said. All right, she said. And then, because she was Kate Wells and directness was her native language. What are you doing in Caldwell? Not the auction. Before. Why were you here? He reached into his coat and produced the folded letter. He held it for a moment without unfolding it, and she could see something cross his face, the complicated expression she had noticed yesterday at the auction platform. Then he put the letter on the table and slid it toward her. She did not touch it. You can tell me, she said. You don't have to show me. He seemed almost relieved by that. He put the letter back in his pocket. I was born in Caldwell, he said. I left when I was 18. I've been trying to make something of myself in the years since. Mostly I've managed it. I came back because I received word that my father's house was being sold. He died in April. We were not close, but he was my father. Did you buy the house? I looked at it, he said. I decided against it. The house is just a house. It doesn't need to be mine. He looked at her steadily. The auction was on my way out of town. And you stopped. I stopped. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Kate was aware that she was sitting across the table from a man she had known for less than a day, in the kitchen of the farmhouse she had built her life in, and that the sitting felt less strange than it should have. She was also aware that this feeling was itself a kind of warning, the sort of thing that needed to be noted and filed carefully rather than acted on without examination. Where are you going? She asked. After Caldwell. He thought about it. I had a plan to go north, he said. Nebraska. There's land there, good land, and I've saved enough to start something new. Why new? She asked. He looked at her. Because the old things needed leaving behind. She thought about that. Dark past, she said, not unkindly. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but related to one. You could call it that. Mr. Yates, Kate said, leaning forward slightly. You spent $412 this morning and have now told me a story that explains the moral impulse without fully explaining the man. I am grateful to you. Profoundly grateful, in a way I'm not sure I have words for yet. And I am also a woman who has learned to be careful, because the frontier does not reward the incautious. So I want to ask you directly, what is it that you haven't told me? He looked at her for a long time. The morning sun was moving through the kitchen window, and it caught the side of his face, showing the lines that weather and years had put there, showing also something younger underneath them, something that had not yet been entirely resigned. I am a man who made a promise to a dying friend, he said, and has not yet figured out how to keep it. I am a man with no living family and no permanent home, and more money saved than I know what to do with alone. I am a man who stood at the back of an auction yard this morning and watched someone be humiliated for having the wrong amount of money, and I recognized something in it that made it impossible to walk away. He paused. That's the whole of it, Mrs. Wells. There's no trap, no hidden motive. I'm not after your land. I'm not working for Crane. I just saw a thing that needed doing and I did it. She looked at him. She believed him. She did not quite know what to do with believing him, so she refilled his coffee cup and stood up and said, I have to go to the well. You're welcome to stay for breakfast if you want eggs, and if you want to be useful, the pump handle on the east side of the barn needs looking at. He blinked. Then finally he smiled. It was a real smile, and it changed his face entirely, opened it up, made it younger and considerably more dangerous to her equilibrium. "I can look at a pump," he said. "Good," said Kate Wells and picked up her bucket. He stayed for 3 days, not in the farmhouse. She was a widow alone on a property 4 miles from town, and she had a reputation to consider, so he slept in the barn, on the pile of clean hay she showed him without comment, and he seemed to find this entirely acceptable. Each morning he was up before she was, or so she assumed, because by the time she came out at first light the barn chores were half done, and he was usually somewhere on the property doing something that needed doing. He fixed the pump handle. He restrung the section of fence along the north field that had been sagging since spring. He cleared the drainage channel behind the chicken coop that had been silting up and causing muddy ground near the henhouse. He did these things without being asked, and he did them correctly, which she found remarkable. Most men, in her experience, either waited to be asked or did things incorrectly or both. Noah Yates seemed to be the kind of person who looked at a problem, understood it, and addressed it without fanfare. They ate their meals at the kitchen table. They talked. This was the surprising part. Kate had not, since Thomas died, had anyone at that table for regular conversation, and she had not realized how much she had missed it until it was there. Not that she was lonely exactly. She had the neighbors, the Proots and the Beckers, and she went to town, and she was not isolated in any dramatic sense. But there was something different about the dinner table conversation of a specific person, someone whose thoughts she was curious about, someone who made her lean forward without meaning to. Noah Yates was a deeply read man. He had been formally educated only to the age of 14, he told her, but he had been reading ever since, steadily and across a wide range, history and natural science and whatever novels he could get hold of, carried in saddlebags and borrowed from whoever would lend them. He had opinions about things that Kate also had opinions about, and their opinions sometimes matched and sometimes did not, and both cases were interesting. He asked about her, too. He asked good questions, the kind that showed he had listened to the previous answer. He asked about Ohio and how she had come to marry Thomas and what the first years on the homestead had been like. He asked what she had read and what she thought about the business of women owning land outright, which was a question that made her look at him sharply to see if he was mocking her. He was not. He was genuinely asking. "I think it is absurd that I am legally at such a disadvantage," she said. "I built more of this property than Thomas did, and I have kept it alive for 2 years alone, and the legal situation treats me as though I am an afterthought. I am not an afterthought." "No," he agreed. "You are very much the main event." She had looked at him across the table and he had looked back, and for a moment the kitchen was very quiet again. On the morning of the 4th day, she woke up and knew he was leaving. She knew it before she went outside, before she saw the roan horse already saddled at the gate. She had known it the night before, in the way you sometimes know things in the hours before you are prepared to admit them. He was standing by the horse when she came out. The morning was softer than the last several had been, the sky a pale wash of gold and pink that meant the heat would hold off until afternoon. "Nebraska," she said. "Nebraska," he confirmed. She nodded. She did not ask him to stay because she was not a woman who asked for things she had not established a basis for asking. Instead, she held out her hand. "Thank you, Noah Yates," she said. "I mean it more than I can manage to say." He took her hand. He held it for a moment longer than a handshake required, and she felt it through her whole arm, the warmth of it, the steadiness, the particular pressure of someone holding on before letting go. "Take care of yourself, Kate Wells," he said. "You're worth taking care of." He mounted the roan and rode north without looking back. She stood at the gate until the dust settled, and then she went inside and stood in the middle of her kitchen for a long time, looking at nothing, feeling the particular specific ache of something that had almost been a thing and had not been allowed to become one. Then she made herself breakfast and went out to the field. She tried not to think about him. She was, for the most part, successful. She was a practical woman, and she had a homestead to run, and the summer was giving her better conditions than the last 2 years had managed. And there was real work to do and real progress to be made, and she threw herself into it with the focused intensity that had always been her best defense against things she could not resolve. She repaired the back wall of the farmhouse where the winter had worked on the chinking. She traded 3 jars of her summer preserves to Abe Prout for help with the harvest. She negotiated a better rate at the grain exchange and planted a kitchen garden of a size she had not managed before. She got through August and September with something that was almost optimism, and she thought about Noah Yates, not all the time, not in a way that interfered with anything practical, but in the in-between moments, the early mornings before the day's work began, the evenings on the front step when the sky was doing something beautiful. She thought about his hands around the coffee cup. She thought about the way the smile had changed his face. She thought about the letter in his coat pocket and the promise he had made to a dying friend, and the particular kind of loneliness that she recognized in him because she knew it from the inside. October brought a letter. She did not expect it. She had not given him her address in any formal sense, though it was in the land office records and a determined man could find it. The letter arrived at the post office in Caldwell on a Thursday, and she picked it up when she went to town for flour, and she held it on the walk home without opening it, feeling the weight of it and trying not to attach too much importance to the fact of it. She opened it at the kitchen table. His handwriting was the same as his signature, confident, clear, not ornate. He wrote the way he spoke, directly, without unnecessary decoration. He said, "I arrived in Nebraska. I found land. I have been working on it for 6 weeks, and it is going to be a good place, I think, though it is very quiet." He said, "I thought you would want to know that Delbert Crane was found this month to have been maintaining 2 sets of books on 3 different land transactions, and Fletcher Price, whom you will remember as the thin lawyer, has filed a complaint with the territorial authority. Crane is not in prison yet, but the walls are closing in." He said, "I have been reading a book I found in a Lincoln bookshop and thinking about a conversation we had in your kitchen about the nature of solitude and whether it is a choice or a circumstance." He did not sign it "Love." He signed it, "I hope you are well, Noah Yates." She read the letter 4 times. She wrote back the same evening. She told him about the harvest, which had been better than expected. She told him about Abe Prout's new baby, a boy named Daniel, and about the meadowlark that had come back to the fence post and that she was convinced was the same one from summer, though she knew birds did not work that way. She told him about the book she was reading, which she happened to have borrowed from Mrs. Acker at the boarding house. She told him, after a paragraph of less direct things, that she was glad he was well and that the land in Nebraska sounded like it suited him. She did not sign it "Love" either. She signed it, "With genuine regard, Kate Wells." The letters continued. Once a month at first, then twice, then in the dark short days of December they were arriving nearly every week, and she was aware that this was remarkable and was also aware that she had chosen not to remark upon it because remarking might change the thing, and the thing was one of the better things in her days, and she was not inclined to disturb it. He wrote about Nebraska, about the particular quality of the sky there, which he said was wider than Kansas and also somehow more urgent, as if it had more opinions. He wrote about the work of building something new, the specific satisfactions and frustrations of it. He wrote about his neighbors, a Bohemian family named Kavarek who had arrived the previous year, and were the most practically gifted people he had ever met, the father able to fix anything, the mother able to grow anything, their 3 children running the property like a small, organized army. He wrote, in a January letter, about the promise he had made to his dying friend. His name had been Samuel Reyes, he wrote, a Texas rancher of Mexican descent who had become the finest man Noah had ever known. Samuel had been sick for a year before the end, and in those final weeks he had made Noah promise 2 things. The first was that Noah would use the money Samuel had left him, a considerable amount, earned through years of careful ranching, to help people who were being wronged by powerful men in the way that Noah himself had been wronged. The second was something more personal, something harder to write about. Samuel had said, "Noah, you are a man who has convinced himself that he does not deserve to be loved. I need you to stop believing that." Kate read that letter 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table in January with the stove burning and snow against the windows, and she felt something in her chest that she identified, after careful consideration, as recognition. She wrote back, "I understand about believing you don't deserve things. I spent most of my marriage being grateful for what I had rather than acknowledging what was missing. Not in the marriage itself, Thomas was a good man, but in myself. The acknowledgement that I am someone whose wants are legitimate. It has taken me a long time to understand that being capable and being deserving are not the same thing, and that I am both." She paused over that paragraph for a long time before she sent it, because it was more honest than she usually allowed herself to be in writing. She sent it. His return letter arrived 10 days later, and it was different from the previous ones. It was longer, and the handwriting was slightly less controlled, as if he had written quickly, which was not characteristic. He said, "Kate, I need to tell you something. I have been thinking about Caldwell since July. Not the town. You. I have been thinking about you, in a way that is no longer something I can file under the category of coincidence or general goodwill toward another person. I have been thinking about your kitchen and the meadowlark and the way you looked at me across the auction yard, and I have spent considerable time and effort convincing myself that these thoughts were not relevant to anything practical, because you are in Kansas and I am in Nebraska, and my life is more complicated than I have fully explained, and I do not want to be a man who causes trouble for someone who has had enough trouble. But Samuel made me promise to stop believing I don't deserve things, and I am trying to keep my promises. So I am telling you, I have been thinking about you." Kate put the letter down on the table. She sat with it for a long time. Outside, the January snow had stopped, and the sky was that particular hard blue of a clear winter day on the Kansas plain, and the world was very still and very cold and very bright. She wrote back the same day. She said, "Noah, I have been thinking about you too, in a way that has also been inconvenient and persistent and has not responded to practicality. I find this embarrassing to admit, as I am a woman who has prided herself on practicality, but you asked for honesty, and honesty seems like the right thing to give you. I am thinking about you. I do not know what to do about it from here, given the practical difficulties you correctly identified, but I am telling you. I am thinking about you." She signed it, Kate, just Kate, not Kate Wells or with genuine regard. His letter came back in 8 days, which was faster than the post usually moved, which meant he had sent it the day he received hers or possibly the day after. He said, "I am coming to Caldwell in March. If you will have me for a visit," she said, "I will." March was still 2 months away, and she had 2 months of winter to get through on a prairie homestead, which required the complete attention of a capable person, and Kate gave it that complete attention. She fixed the stovepipe where it had developed a crack. She patched the barn roof where ice had worked under 2 shingles. She taught herself, from a book she had ordered from a shop in Topeka, a more efficient method of keeping her accounts, and she applied it and found that her financial situation, while not prosperous, was manageable and potentially improving. She also, in the evenings, thought about what she was going to say to Noah Yates when he arrived in March. She had not been courted, not really, not as an adult woman who understood what she wanted and what she was willing to give. She had married Thomas at 22 with the romantic confidence of youth, and had grown into who she was inside the marriage rather than before it. She was 30 years old now, and she knew her own mind with a precision she had not possessed at 22, and what she knew was this: she was not interested in another marriage that required her to diminish herself in order to fit inside it. She was not interested in a partnership that was not genuinely a partnership. She was interested in a man who saw her clearly and was not frightened by what he saw, and she was interested in this specific man, because, in 4 days and 5 months of letters, She had not once felt the need to present a softer version of herself. He arrived on a Thursday in early March, 2 days after the last hard frost had broken and the sky had shifted to the cleaner, lighter blue of approaching spring. She heard the horse on the road and came out to the gate, and he was there, the same roan horse, the same dark coat, looking like he had ridden through weather to get there, which he probably had because Nebraska in February was not gentle. He stopped the horse at the gate and looked at her. She looked at him. "You look well," he said. "You look like you've ridden through a blizzard," she said. "Two of them," he said. "The second one apologized." She laughed. It came out before she could moderate it, a genuine laugh, and she saw his face change the way it had in the kitchen in July, opening up into that real smile, and she thought, there it is. There is the thing I have been carrying in letters for months, made actual and present and standing at my gate. "Come inside," she said. "There's coffee." He stayed a week. It was a different week from the one in July. In July, there had been the shock and the gratitude and the careful calibration of a woman deciding how much to trust someone she did not know. In March, there was still care and still calibration, but the calibration was of a different kind. It was the calibration of two people who knew each other's minds from months of correspondence and were now discovering the physical reality of that knowledge, the way a person fits into a space, the sound of someone's voice in a room rather than on a page. They walked the property together in the early mornings, the way she walked it every day to check on things, and he walked with her and listened and asked questions and occasionally offered observations that were useful. They cooked together in the evenings, which was something she had not done with another person since Thomas, and she had forgotten how different it was, how the kitchen changed when there was someone else moving in it. On the third evening, sitting on the front step in the last light of a mild March day, he told her the rest of the dark past, the things he had not put in letters. After his Texas partner had betrayed him and Samuel Reyes had saved him, Noah had spent 2 years working for wages, building back his confidence along with his savings, and in those 2 years he had made one decision that he had been living with ever since. He had been engaged briefly to a woman in a town called Marfa, Texas. Her name had been Clara, and she had been kind and pretty and entirely unsuited to the frontier life, though neither of them had understood that fully at the time. They had been engaged for 6 months, and then Clara had broken the engagement and moved back east, and Noah had spent a year telling himself this was a failure and another year understanding that it had been a mercy for both of them. But it had reinforced, in ways he had not fully examined until Samuel had forced him to, his belief that he was fundamentally a man other people eventually left. His mother had died when he was 9. His father had been a distant and disappointed man. His business partner had betrayed him. His fiancée had left. He had built from these facts a story about himself that was logical and wrong, and it had taken Samuel and then 5 months of letters to a woman in Kansas to begin to dismantle it. Kate listened to all of this without interruption, which was a thing she had always been able to do but had gotten better at in the years alone, when listening to the prairie itself was sometimes the only option. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, watching the first stars come out above the dark line of the plain. "I lost Thomas very suddenly," she said, "and the 2 years after were hard in ways that were practical and also in ways that were not. And somewhere in the hard, not practical ways I made my own wrong story, that I was someone who managed, that managing was enough, that wanting more was a kind of ingratitude." She paused. "You told me in a letter that being capable and being deserving are not the same thing. I said that. I wrote it to you. But I want you to know that I wrote it because I was also saying it to myself." He turned to look at her. In the last of the light, his face was very clear to her, clearer than anything had been in a long time. "Kate," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like very much to court you properly," he said. "If that is something you would consider." She looked at him. She considered the word properly, which contained multitudes in 1879 Kansas, including the implication of intentions that were honorable and eventual and serious. She considered the fact that Nebraska was a significant ride north. She considered her homestead and her mule patience and her meadowlark and her coffee tin and her deed. She considered how she had felt every single morning for the last 5 months when she sat down to read a letter that began with her name in his confident handwriting. "Yes," she said, "I would consider that." Spring went forward in the way that Kansas springs do, with that particular combination of hope and peril that the frontier specialized in. Noah rode back to Nebraska to look after his land through the spring planting, and Kate tended her own, and they wrote letters that were no longer carefully calibrated but were something rawer and more honest. Letters in which two people who had spent their respective lives being careful were practicing, with varying degrees of grace, the art of being unguarded. He wrote about Nebraska mornings, about the particular sound of geese flying north over his property at dawn. She wrote about the way the wheat looked coming up green after the long brown winter, and about the fight she had won with a merchant in Caldwell who had tried to charge her more than the listed price for a piece of equipment, and about the fact that Delbert Crane had been formally charged with fraud and was going to stand trial in June. He came back in June for the trial. He did not say this was why he was coming, but she understood it. He came because the trial was dangerous territory, because Crane's remaining influence in the county meant that Kate's presence at the proceedings required someone beside her who was not going to be intimidated. He came because it was the right thing to do, and because he wanted to be there, and because by June, 5 months into the proper courtship, they were both operating on an understanding that had not yet been spoken aloud but had been building in every letter and every conversation and every morning walk around the property. Delbert Crane was found guilty of fraud on a Thursday afternoon in the Caldwell courthouse. Fletcher Price, the thin young lawyer, had built a careful and thorough case. Two of Crane's former business partners had come forward as witnesses, men who had their own quiet grievances and were glad of the opportunity to press them. Crane's falsified records were entered into evidence, the double books that had been discovered by the Territorial Authority investigation that had begun, in part, because of the questions raised at Kate's auction. Crane was sentenced to 2 years in the territorial prison and a substantial fine. His sons, who had not been directly implicated, sold the ranch and moved south, which was the last Kate ever heard of them. Walking out of the courthouse in the June sunshine, Noah took her hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. He simply put his hand around hers as they came down the steps, as if this was something they had always done, as if it was the most natural thing available. She felt it the same way she had felt the handshake in July at the auction platform, through her whole arm and then through the rest of her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer sun. She turned her hand and held his back. They walked down the main street of Caldwell like that. People noticed. People in small frontier towns always noticed. She did not care. She had carried her life on her own back for 2 years and had earned the right to hold someone's hand in public if she chose. That evening, on the front step again, with the prairie dark and the stars extravagant overhead, he asked her. He did it plainly, without theater, which was appropriate. He said he had thought about how to do this properly, that he had considered and rejected several more elaborate approaches, and that he had concluded that the right way was the direct one, because she was a woman who valued directness, and he was a man who had finally learned to be honest about what he wanted. He said he wanted to marry her. Not out of gratitude, not out of circumstance, not out of any reason except that she was the most fully realized person he had ever known, and that the letters and the kitchen and the morning walks had added up to something he was not willing to pretend was anything less than it was. He said he understood that there were practical difficulties, the Nebraska land, the Kansas homestead, the question of where and how, and that he was prepared to work through every single one of them if she was willing. He said her name, just her name, Kate. She sat with it for a moment. She was 30 years old. She was a woman who had built things and lost things and saved them. She had walked 4 miles to an auction with $1 in her hand, because she refused to give up on what she had made, and she had walked away from that auction with the only thing worth having, which had not turned out to be the deed at all. The only thing worth having had turned out to be the man who had given it back to her. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Noah Yates." He kissed her then, for the first time, on the front step of the farmhouse with the prairie stars overhead, a kiss that was both gentle and decided, the kiss of two people who had traveled a considerable distance through grief and hardship, and letter writing to arrive at this specific coordinates on this specific evening, and who understood exactly what they were arriving at. She was very glad she had walked to that auction. They married in September. It was a practical wedding by the standards of frontier propriety, held at the Caldwell Community Church on a Saturday morning with a congregation of neighbors and the Pruitts and the Beckers and Mrs. Acker from the boarding house, and, unexpectedly, the Kavarick family from Nebraska, who had driven 2 days south because, as Marta Kavarick explained in accented English with great warmth, a man as decent as Noah Yates deserved to have someone at his wedding who had known him before he found his happiness. Fletcher Price, the thin young lawyer, had handled the legal documentation with quiet efficiency and a great deal of personal satisfaction, having been the one who had confirmed the legality of Noah's auction, bid all those months ago, and having since come to regard both Kate Wells and Noah Yates as the kind of people who made a county worth practicing law in. The Reverend Middleton, a spare Nebraskan of the Fire and Compassion School of Frontier Clergy, conducted the ceremony with brevity and sincerity. When he asked Kate if she took this man, she said yes with such clarity and conviction that the Reverend smiled mid-sentence. They had spent the weeks before the wedding working through the practical difficulties, which were real and required real solutions. The Nebraska land was good land and represented a genuine investment and opportunity, but Kate's Kansas homestead was her life's work, the thing she had nearly lost and had saved and had rebuilt, and she was not willing to abandon it. They had discussed this at length, in letters and in person, and the solution they arrived at was both practical and characteristic of who they both were. They would keep both properties. The Kansas homestead would be improved and leased to a capable farming family, which would generate income and keep the land in good use while allowing Kate and Noah to build their life in Nebraska, which had more available land and better prospects for expansion. Kate would come back to the Kansas property twice a year to check on it, and she and Noah would make the decision together in 5 years about whether to sell or continue. Nothing would be surrendered or decided under pressure. Kate had looked at him across the table where they had laid out this plan and said, "You are the most sensible man I have ever met." He had said, "You are the most capable woman I have ever met." She had said, "We are going to be all right." He had said, "Yes, we are." They moved to Nebraska in October, after the wedding, after the lease of the Kansas homestead had been arranged with a German immigrant family named Hoffman who were serious and hardworking, and who treated the farmhouse with a respect that Kate felt as a physical relief. She rode out to say goodbye to the farmhouse on the morning of their departure, alone, while Noah finished loading the wagon. She stood at the front step and looked at the low hill south of the house where Thomas was buried, and she said goodbye to Thomas in the quiet way she had been saying it in increments for 2 years, the long, gradual goodbye that widowhood required. She touched the doorframe of the house she had built with her own hands. She did not cry. She had done all the crying that was needed. She felt instead the extraordinary lightness of someone who has set down a weight they have been carrying for a long time, not because the weight was bad, but because they have finally found somewhere safe to put it. She walked back to the wagon where Noah was waiting, his hat in his hand, looking at her with the careful attention he gave to things he wanted to understand fully. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. He helped her up to the wagon seat and climbed up beside her and clicked the horses forward north, toward Nebraska and the wide, urgent sky he had written about in letters, and Kate Wells, who was now Kate Yates though she was Kate Wells in certain things and always would be, sat beside her husband in the October morning, and felt the road open up in front of them like a promise she intended to keep. Nebraska was everything he had described. The sky was wider. The land rolled differently from Kansas, with a more varied topography, gentle hills and creek bottoms and stretches of high grass that moved in the wind with a sound she found, in the first weeks, almost musical. The Yates property was 80 acres on the eastern side of a creek that ran reliably, which was not something to take for granted in the Prairie West, and Noah had already built a good solid house, better than the one she had left in Kansas, with 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above, and a covered porch that faced east to catch the morning light. She spent the first weeks learning the place the way she learned all places, by moving through it at different times of day and in different weathers, by finding the spots where the water ran and the places where the wind came from, and the field sections where the soil was deepest. She went to the Kavarik farm, half a mile north, and introduced herself to Marta and Jakob Kavarik, who received her with the warmth they had shown at the wedding, and a meal that suggested Marta Kavarik's practical gifts extended thoroughly to cooking. Noah watched her learn Nebraska the same way she had watched him learn the Kansas homestead in July and March, with a quiet attention that she found both comfortable and moving. He had been here 6 months before her. He knew the land, but he had the wisdom to let her find it herself, only offering guidance when she asked for it, which she did regularly, and without embarrassment because asking for knowledge from someone who had it was practical rather than weak. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was hard in the way Nebraska winters were hard, which was considerable, but they were in it together, and together changed the nature of difficulty in a way Kate had not fully anticipated. She had been through 2 Kansas winters alone and had managed them, but managing was not the same as this. This was 2 people who knew how to work, working in concert, and the result was something more than the sum of its parts. In the evenings she read and he read, in the sitting room where the stove burned, with the wind off the plains rattling the windows in a register somewhat higher than the Kansas wind, which she was still calibrating. They talked. They argued sometimes, not bitterly, but with the genuine friction of 2 strong-minded people with well-developed opinions, and the arguments were usually interesting and generally resolved in ways that left both of them feeling heard, which was the best outcome an argument could produce. She discovered things about him in the close quarters of a Nebraska winter that she had not been able to see in letters or in the limited visiting of the summer and fall. She discovered that he was a man who took care of things before they broke, always checking the seals and the caulking and the equipment before problems developed. She discovered that he could not sleep well during storms, something he had never mentioned, and that he would get up in the dark hours and check on the animals in the barn and come back, and she would reach out and find his hand in the dark, and he would be still again. She discovered that he cried once very quietly in December when they were talking about Samuel Ray's, and he was telling her a particular story about Samuel's oldest son learning to ride, and the grief for his friend came up through the story like water through cracked ground. She did not say anything. She just moved closer to him on the sitting room bench and sat there until it passed, and afterward he looked at her with an expression that was gratitude of a different kind than the gratitude for practical things. She told him, that same winter, about the specific loneliness of the year after Thomas died. Not the practical loneliness, which she had described in letters, but the other kind, the existential loneliness of being surrounded by a life she had helped build and feeling invisible inside it. She told him about the months when she had not been sure, in the deep and private dark of herself, that she was going to be all right. He listened to all of it with the attention he brought to things he wanted to understand fully. "You're the most honest person I've ever known," he said when she was done. "Honesty is a survival skill," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but it's also courage." Spring came to Nebraska with the kind of extravagance that followed hard winters, the creek running full, the grass coming up impossibly green, a riot of wildflowers along the south ridge that made Kate stand at the edge of the field for 10 minutes just looking at it one April morning. She was planting a kitchen garden on the east side of the house, a large one, and she was experimenting with a variety of squash that the Kavarik family had brought from Bohemia, and that Marta Kavarik swore would produce more abundantly than the American varieties. She was also, by April, carrying their first child. She told Noah on a Thursday morning in April, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, in the same direct way she told him everything. She said she believed she was pregnant, and she was fairly certain she was about 3 months along, and she was both glad and nervous, and she wanted him to know all three of those things simultaneously without having to interpret them. He sat across the table from her and looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him processing it, the way he processed large things, carefully and without rushing. Then his face did the thing it did, the opening up, but more thoroughly than she had ever seen it, more completely than the smile in the July kitchen or the March evening or any of the occasions before. He looked as if something he had believed to be permanently sealed had been opened. "Kate," he said. "I know," she said. He came around the table and she stood up and he held her, which was the right thing, the exact right thing. She felt his hands on her back and his face against her hair and the solid warmth of him, and she thought, with the particular clarity of a woman who has earned her own perspective through years of difficult terrain, this is the thing. This is what I walked 4 miles for with $1 in my hand. The summer was good. The crop was good. Noah's Nebraska land was producing well, and Kate's Kansas homestead, under the Hoffman steady management, was generating a reliable lease income that had stabilized their finances considerably. Kate managed the accounts because she was better at it, and because Noah readily acknowledged this and had none of the pride about it that some men would have carried. They made decisions together about the property and the crops and the plans for the future, and they argued about some of the decisions and agreed about others, and the farm ran well. She kept up her correspondence. She wrote to the Pruitts in Kansas, and to Mrs. Acker, and to Fletcher Price, who had risen considerably in the estimation of the Caldwell legal community after the Crane trial, and who wrote back occasional letters in his precise legal hand that always contained some piece of interesting county news. She wrote to her sister in Ohio, longer letters than she had managed in years, because she had more to write about, and because the happiness that had come into her life had paradoxically made her more willing to reach toward people rather than less. She also wrote, on a cold November morning in 1880, with the baby 3 weeks old and asleep in the cradle Noah had built in the sitting room, to the Ray's family in Texas. She had found the address in Noah's correspondence file, which she managed with his knowledge and permission. She wrote to Samuel Ray's widow, a woman named Esperanza, to introduce herself and to say that Samuel's influence on Noah's life had brought about a happiness that she wanted Esperanza to know about, because good people who do good things deserve to have their effects traced. Esperanza Reyes wrote back in February, a letter in Spanish that Kate could read imperfectly and Noah translated, a generous and warm letter from a woman who was managing her own grief in her own way, and who was genuinely glad to hear that Samuel's last instructions had taken root. The baby was a boy. They named him Samuel Thomas Yates, Samuel for Noah's friend and Thomas for Kate's first husband, because Kate had insisted that Thomas deserved to be remembered, and Noah had agreed with such warmth that it made her love him more. They called him Sam, and he was from the beginning a child of remarkable presence, large for his age and curious about everything, a combination of his father's physical solidity and his mother's relentless interest in how things worked. The years moved forward the way years do on the frontier, in seasons, in the rhythm of planting and harvesting and surviving winters and celebrating springs. They were not easy years. The frontier was not an easy place, not in 1881 or 1882 or the years that followed, and there were droughts and market fluctuations, and the particular ordinary difficulties of building a life in a place that was still being made. But they were good years. They were the years in which two people who had both separately learned to manage alone discovered, in the daily and ongoing project of building something together, what it was that managing alone had been missing. In 1882, Kate's Kansas homestead lease came to its natural review point, and they made the decision together, sitting at the Nebraska kitchen table with Sam asleep in the next room and the account books spread between them. They kept it. The Hoffmans were excellent tenants, and the income was reliable, and Kate would not have been herself if she had not retained some claim to the land she had nearly lost at an auction with $1. They rode down together in September of that year to check on the property, Kate and Noah and Sam, who was 2 years old, and regarded the journey as the greatest adventure yet undertaken by humanity. Kate stood in front of the Kansas farmhouse and looked at the low hill to the south, where the grass grew tall over Thomas's grave, and she felt the completeness of it, the way one chapter of a life sits within the larger story without diminishing either. Noah stood beside her. Sam was asleep in the wagon behind them, exhausted from the journey. "This is where everything changed," Noah said. "An auction yard on a Tuesday," Kate said. "I almost didn't stop," he said. "I had my foot in the stirrup. I was going to ride right past." She looked at him. "What made you stop?" He looked at her steadily with those dark, complicated eyes that she knew now as well as she knew her own, that she had read across kitchen tables and in letters and in the dark of Nebraska winters. "I saw the notice at the land office the day before," he said. "It said, Wells property 160 acres to be auctioned, and I thought about Samuel, about the morning he stood up for me. And I thought, what kind of man am I if I ride past this?" She put her hand in his. "A very different kind of story," she said. "A different life," he said. "Mine without you in it." She leaned against him there in the Kansas September sun, in front of the farmhouse she had built and saved and learned to carry lightly, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there for a while, which was something they had learned to do in Nebraska, to stand in good moments and let them be fully what they were. They drove back to Nebraska the next day. Sam grew up to be a boy who looked like his father and asked questions like his mother, a combination that Noah Yates found both charming and occasionally exhausting. He was 6 years old when his sister was born, in the spring of 1886, a girl they named Clara Grace, and Noah had looked at Kate after the name was settled and said, "Are you sure?" And Kate had said, "Clara was a kind woman who made the right decision for herself, and I am glad she did, and your daughter should have a name with honesty in it." So Clara Grace it was. Sam was an excellent older brother. He taught Clara everything he knew about the Nebraska property with the seriousness of a small landowner, walking her along the fence lines and explaining the creek and showing her where the meadowlarks nested in the south field, because Kate had brought her affection for meadowlarks to Nebraska along with everything else, and they had nested there for years. By 1888, the Yates property had grown to 120 acres, acquired in 2 additional purchases from neighboring families who had moved on or sold out, and Noah managed it with the patient thoroughness of a man who had learned to build things the right way the first time. Kate managed the accounts and the business correspondence, and had, by this point, become the person in the county that other struggling homesteaders came to for practical advice, which she gave freely and without condescension, because she remembered what it had been to need that knowledge and not know where to get it. She heard in 1888 that Harold Finch, the former Caldwell bank manager who had sold her debt to Delbert Crane, had retired from banking and was living quietly in Topeka, reportedly with a considerable private burden of guilt about the Crane affair. She considered, for about 20 minutes, whether to write him a letter. She decided against it, not out of continued anger but because there was nothing left to say. What had happened had happened. It had brought her to an auction with $1. The rest was hers. The letter she did write that year was to Fletcher Price, who had moved from Caldwell to Kansas City, and was now practicing the considerably more lucrative form of law available in a larger city, though he told Kate in correspondence that he missed the simplicity of frontier cases where the moral stakes were clear. He had married a woman named Agnes, who Kate had met once and liked immediately. Kate wrote to tell him about the Nebraska expansion and about the children, and to tell him that she still thought about the morning in the auction yard, and that his quiet nod of legal confirmation had mattered more than he might have known. He wrote back, "I think about it often myself. It was the best Tuesday morning I ever had in my professional life." Noah, in the autumn of 1888, at the age of 42, was a man who had become something that he had genuinely not believed himself capable of becoming in the years when he was building wrong stories about himself. He was a man at home. Not just in the physical sense, though the Nebraska house was a real home now, enlarged and improved over the years into something comfortable and durable. He was a man who had stopped expecting the people he loved to leave. He had stopped waiting for the thing he had built to be taken away. He had found, in the daily ordinary life he shared with Kate and Sam and Clara, the stable ground that Samuel Ray's had pointed him toward in a dying man's final instructions. He still carried the letter Samuel had written, the one that had been in his coat pocket in the Caldwell auction yard in 1879. It was worn now, the folds fragile, but he had never replaced it with a copy. He kept it in the box on the shelf above the writing desk, next to the first letter Kate had sent him in the October after the auction, and he had not read either letter in years because he did not need to. He knew what they said. He carried what they meant in a different place. Kate Wells, who was Kate Yates in legal documents but Kate Wells in certain private reckonings of herself, was 39 years old in 1888 and was, she knew, in the best years of her life. She was a woman who had walked into an auction with $1 and refused to be made small, and the world had, against considerable odds, responded to that refusal with something she had not expected and had learned, slowly and with considerable work, to accept without guilt. She loved Noah Yates with the clear-eyed, durable, fully examined love of a woman who knew exactly what she was choosing and had chosen it on purpose. She loved the way he moved through a problem, the way he handled the children, the way he still, after 9 years, looked at her across a room with an attention that made her feel seen all the way through. She loved his hands and the gray that was now thoroughly settled at his temples, and the fact that he still couldn't sleep well during storms and still went to check on the animals in the dark hours. She also still fought with him occasionally, when their strong opinions diverged, and those fights were vigorous and never about the fundamental things, only about the particular decisions where two intelligent people had different views. They were good fights, resolved usually by the method of one of them making an argument that was better than the others and the other acknowledging it, because they were both capable of acknowledging when they were wrong, which was not as easy as it sounded and which they had each worked at. In November of 1888, Sam, who was 8 years old, asked his father why they had 2 properties in 2 different states, the one in Nebraska where they lived and the one in Kansas where they sometimes went to visit. Noah had looked at Kate across the dinner table and Kate had looked at Noah, and Sam, who was perceptive, had looked at both of them and said, "Is it a long story?" "Yes," said Kate. "Would you like to hear it?" "Yes," said Sam. So Kate told him. She told him about the farmhouse in Kansas and Thomas, whom she described with honest affection as a man who dreamed large and loved her well, and about the drought and the debt and the auction. She told him about the dollar in her hand and Harlan Dodd's laughter and Delbert Crane in the front row. She told him about the man standing still at the fence post when everyone else was moving. Sam had been listening with his complete attention, which he always gave to stories. "And then what?" he said. Kate looked at Noah. Noah was looking at her with the expression she knew best of all his expressions, the one that was all the things she had learned to read over 9 years and more letters than she could count, the one that was, at its simplest and most accurate translation, everything. "And then," Kate said, turning back to her son, "I took the deed and I thanked him and I meant to walk away. But the thing about good people is that they are very hard to walk away from. Did you walk away? Sam asked. I tried, Kate said. Did he follow you? He said he was going to the livery stable, Kate said, which was technically true. Sam considered this. Did you know you were going to marry him? Kate thought about it. She thought about the 4 miles home from the Caldwell auction yard and the dollar still warm in her hand, and the way she had been thinking about Noah Yates the entire way without fully admitting she was doing it. I knew, she said, that I had been given back something I almost lost, and that the person who gave it to me was worth knowing. She picked up her coffee cup. The rest revealed itself in time. Sam sat with this for a moment. Then he said with the practical honesty of an 8-year-old, So you left with a husband instead of a dollar. Kate laughed. Noah laughed. Clara, who was 2 and did not understand the joke but wanted to participate, laughed also. Not exactly, Kate said. I left with the deed. The husband came later. But the deed was always going to be yours, Sam said, with the logic of a child who was paying very close attention. Kate looked at her son. She looked at her husband. She looked at the table they sat around in the Nebraska house that they had built into something warm and permanent and full of the particular ordinary extraordinary richness of 2 people who had chosen each other thoroughly. Yes, she said. It was. Outside, the November wind was moving through the tall grass of the Nebraska plain with that sound she had learned to love in the years since Kansas, the sound of a wide country going about its business, the sound that had been, in the worst years, lonely and isolating, and in the best years, which were these years, simply the sound of the world being the world, full of storms and droughts and auctions and letters and people standing still when everyone else was laughing, and a woman walking 4 miles with $1 in her hand toward everything she did not yet know was coming. Kate Yates, née Wells, set down her coffee cup and looked out the November window at the Nebraska sky, that wider, more urgent sky that her husband had described in the first letter, and she felt the full accumulated weight of what had been built, not just the land or the house or the crops in the ledger, but the years of letters and the kitchen conversations, and the morning walks and the hard winters and the spring wildflowers and the 2 children and the grief set down properly, and the joy taken up without apology. She felt the whole of it, and it was good, and it was hers, and it was enough, and it was more than enough. And outside the November wind kept moving and the stars came out over the Nebraska plain, and the house was warm, and Kate Wells, who had walked to an auction with $1 and left with the only thing worth having, was home.